Thank you everyone for coming to the May 2025 online Castle Studies group talk. Oh, hang on, actually, I need to get the setting just right. Hopefully, if that's worked, you will be able to see me in the bottom corner of the screen. If not, don't worry, I'm not the important bit. It's very much about the place on screen, Pevensey Castle. I'll be talking today a bit about the history of the site, its enormous span of history, and zooming in to events in 1216. Um, that's because that year King John gave an instruction to demolish Pevensey Castle. And so that is, of course, my area of interest. So I'll be exploring what the evidence is for that. Let's This is the experiment. I'm using Google Earth here to see if I can recreate a tour of the site. If you're familiar with Pevensey, hopefully there'll be some new stuff. Apologies if we're going over old ground, but I think it's worth having a look at. So Pevensey is a really interesting place because it's a medieval castle built within a Roman fort. If you're familiar with Roman forts, you may be aware that they very often had a playing card shape with a couple of roads running across the inside at right angles to each other. It was a very typical arrangement. What you might notice about Pevensey is that it very much is not rectangular. It's uh, oval shape. The reason for that is that when the Roman fort was established around 290 AD, it was kind of a peninsula. So it was determined by the lay of the ground, which is a bit unusual for a Roman fort, but gives it this distinctive shape for the period, this oval. And we can see in the corner we have the medieval as it was created. I zoom out as well, we can see that the coast to the southeast. This is really important because that is a significant landscape change. Way back in the Roman period, the was pretty much a curtain. Well, this area here, underneath the text which says Pevensey Levels National Nature Reserve, would have been sometimes marshland, but often worked as a natural harbour as well. And this seems to have been largely the case in the mid-11th century when the conqueror landed at Norman's Bay. It was a large natural bay and could accommodate William's 700 ships. So it indicates that it was a very important landing point. And that will become important later on in the story as well. You can still see that it's the Roman fort. Then it's very busy place. It's built within a Roman fort, which is sieges, which again is an unusual number for castles. In fact, very often castles wouldn't be besieged at all. Oh, good to know. So when I move the image, my audio breaks up. I'll keep that in mind and keep the movement to a minimum. And when it is moving, I'll try not to talk. So thank you very much for those suggestions. So It's unusual in that it saw military action and was based within a Roman fort. Let me check. Cool. So we therefore have, it's not quite your typical castle. And there are some really weird bits about Pevensey as well. If you're familiar with what keeps look like, um, Pevensey's is a bit different. Doesn't really look like that at all. Across the centuries, it's been rebuilt um, a couple of times, and there are so many different periods of activity at the castle that it obscures a lot of what's come before. So we've got these great Roman curtain walls enclosing the site, and in a corner is a wrong wrong term for an oval shape, but in one segment of the Roman fort, we have this extra enclosure, which is the medieval core of the castle. But it's also worth noting that the site was largely ruinous by the Elizabethan period, at which point there were discussions about preparing it um, for defending the coast against invasion from Spain. Uh, and in the 20th century, the ruins were open to the public, but then adapted during the Second World War through the addition of anti tank obstacles, these great concrete blocks, and pillboxes, which were camouflaged within the castle walls. If you go there today, some of those gun emplacements are still visible, and they're pretty well disguised. So we've got an awful lot going on at Pevensey. But as well as the military stuff, it was um, linked to the royal family. It was at various points held by the crown and was quite the status symbol, I'd say. It was given to favorites of the royal family. It was sometimes used by members of royalty, and in fact was used as a prison at various points as well for the social elite. One of the King Jameses of Scotland was imprisoned here at Pevensey, as well as Henry V's stepmother. So there was an awful lot going on. Pevensey nicely encapsulates the aspects of administrative importance, high status living, and military use all in one place. So that's an odd place with the Roman material and lots of sieges. It also gets to the heart of what castles were all about. Okay, so let's quite literally zoom in and talk a bit about the events of 1216. Okay, hopefully my computer will be able to keep up. But what I've done here is I've brought the inner Bailey into focus a bit. We can see the gatehouse on the right, some towers making up the rest of the circuit, and that stump of a building, which is roughly in the middle of the screen, is the base of the medieval keep. So what we have here is the medieval heart of the castle. There would have been activity in the Bailey, as the rest of the Roman fort was, but this is the social core. This is where all the high status buildings were. The Great Hall, accommodation, a medieval chapel, which is just out of sight. Um, so there was an awful lot of activity here. So, what happened in 1216? Why is this of such interest to me in particular? Well, in 1216, King John was at war with his barons. So, this was in response to Magna Carta and John trying to weasel his way out of it. I try not to deal in generalizations, but as far as generalizations go, King John being a bit of a bad egg seems about right. He was as it seems, pretty unpleasant person. Not just um, he managed to fall out with the Pope, the barons, pretty much anyone he came across. Um, there was rumour of a plot against him in 1212, and in response, he confiscated the property of the people involved. So this involved um, some castles in northern England and one of the castles in London as well, uh, Baynard's Tower. That, in fact, was demolished as an act of punishment. This slighting as a way of stamping your authority on an occasion. But in the north, the properties that were confiscated weren't destroyed. The reason for that probably being that they were too important because of their border location to actually destroy. Now, in 1216, the war for John actually started quite well. He initially um, was having military success. He was traveling a lot across the country, and the barons needed help from outside of England. The barons asked the Prince of France to support them. Uh, the Pope was involved in the sense that he excommunicated the Prince of France for supporting the barons. So it was all getting a bit messy. In 1216, the prince landed in Kent with an army. And King John was in the area and was advised to retreat. Uh, if he had met the prince in battle, maybe the war would have gone differently. But at this point, he retreated through southern England and gave instructions to demolish the castles at Hastings and Pevensey. We know this from one of the contemporary chronicles. The documentary record is a bit fragmentary at this point, but I'll come back to that in a bit. So we've got this instance in 1216 where King John is on the back foot and ordering the destruction of fortifications, and it's very clear that the purpose is to prevent them from being used against him. That's a little bit different from how slighting was often used, because sometimes, well, very often in fact, it was used as a form of punishment, as was with the case of the rebels in 1212. But in 1216, it was a very different circumstance. John was worried about these places being used against him. So that's what motivated the act. Now, the reason I've focused on this area of the castle is that this contains some of the earliest extant medieval features. The gatehouse here dates to somewhere about the year 1200. Quite when is up for debate. The keep is assumed to be late 12th century, and the postern, which isn't that visually impressive, so to spare my computer, I'm not going to zoom in on it, but that's thought to date to about the same period as well. What we're looking at here is actually a rebuild of the middle of the 13th century, at which point the castle was held by a royal favourite, Peter of Savoy. He was related to Henry III through marriage. So it was held by a royal favourite, and there was this building program going on. So, quite how this fits in is interesting. Was the castle a ruin at that point? Was Peter bringing it back into use? Or was the damage of 1216 more superficial? Because Pevensey wasn't alone in the instructions to be destroyed in 1216. There was Hastings, as I mentioned. There were other castles in the south. There was Chichester, which was ordered to be destroyed, Knepp in Sussex. John gave instructions to burn that place, and Middleton Stony in Oxfordshire. He also gave instructions to demolish that place as well. So there were quite a few places which he ordered to be destroyed. Some near the coast. Understandably, with Pevensey, I think perhaps what his concern was is that it was close to a possible landing point. It would have been quicker to go to Pevensey than to land in Kent. and it had a very convenient castle as well. So the properties which made it a good place to build a Roman fort, and for William the Conqueror to land in 1066, made it a potential landing point during this war between King John and the barons. So you can see why he was so concerned about it. Now, with all the change that's taken place, our challenge is to work out what was involved with the destruction in 1216. What I'll do is just turn the camera around. Okay, so what I've done is I've changed the view so that we've got the walls of the Roman forts visible as well. Now, what stands out to me is that if you're drawing a castle, you don't need to demolish the entire thing to make it less effective. Um, and that doesn't vary depending on what your motivations are for causing the destruction. If it's symbolic destruction, then you might want something quite prominent. If it's to make it less useful militarily, you perhaps only need to punch a few holes in the walls. So the scale doesn't necessarily change according to the intention. But what that means is there's a very large circuit of walls which would have been giving the castle its great strength in 1216. So the challenge is what would have been involved in this destruction. So part of the challenge is as well that we don't know what the form of the castle was at this point. We are fairly sure that the keep was intact in 1216, and it's likely that the gatehouse was present as well, that inner gatehouse. So that gives us 2 points and the postern. So it seems that there was an enclosure in this section of the castle, probably on a similar footprint to the enclosure we have currently. Now, it looks like any destruction that would have happened would have been carried out hastily. So we're not looking at systematic dismantling of walls. There probably just wouldn't have been time. The idea was to prevent this from falling into hostile hands. So we're looking at something perhaps more along the lines of burning. This was a quick method, relatively anyway, still would have involved a fair amount of work to actually start the fire, and could be used against stone buildings as well as timber. It would be more effective against timber structures. Perhaps there were timber structures at Pevensey at this point, but we just aren't sure. But it's still useful against stone buildings because there were wooden floors, timber roof structures, timber stairs as well. So if you did set fire to the timber elements for Stone Castle, you're still making it much less useful. Now, it could have been pressed back into use with some effort, but it gives us an idea of what might have been involved. I think it's especially interesting as well that at the same time, King John gave instructions to burn Knepp Castle in Sussex. And that's a place which has stone ruins as well. There's not much, but there's a stone tower that has fragmentary remains. So it looks like that was also a stone castle in part, but he gave instructions to burn it. And I think that comes down to the pressures of time. So let's leave behind Google Earth and have a look at something else. This is the plan of the castle, showing its phases. So it's an excellent piece of work by English Heritage. You can see that don't worry about the key. I realize that's very small text, but the pink shows the Roman masonry. You can see that it is the outer circuit. You can also see that various parts of the curtain wall have either collapsed on the north side, so the left-hand side of the screen, and have vanished completely on the south side. This section on the right, which is just a couple of pink lines with white in between. So that gives you the Roman material. The orange parts are 12th century. So we've got the keep near the top and the postern gate. It's a small building, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. There's a yellowy kind of green, which is dated to the late 12th or early 13th century. And that is the gatehouse, almost entirely the gatehouse. And beyond that, we've got this darker shade of green, which is a 13th century material, and then little bits and pieces of adaptation in the 14th century and post-medieval period. This is an illustration of the castle in, I think, the late 16th century. It's an aerial view, so it gives quite a compressed view of the castle. But the interesting thing is that there's a mound there where the keep currently stands, more or less. The broad details of the image are about right. Right number of towers, some fanciful reconstruction, I think, with the wall on the south side, as that has completely vanished. But you've got the gap on the north side. So it's an interesting depiction, a slightly challenging one, but its most interesting point is that the keep is buried in a mound. And that wasn't removed until the start of the 20th century when the Ministry of Works got involved and cleared out the keep. So there's a period of decay later on as well. So it's not entirely clear when we've got sections of wall which have collapsed if it's due to this siege work or later decay, or potentially any of the other three sieges, actually four sieges, that the castle sustained. So it gives us a complex situation to work with. In fact, what's useful is that we have some very rich sources. We have archaeological sources. There have been lots of excavations at the castle, some geophysical surveys, building surveys. We have geographical surveys which have looked at the changing landscape, especially in terms of the coastline. And we have the historical record. So the really good thing is this confluence of sources. So let's start with the historical record. What does it tell us? So about 1216, the answer is not a lot. It just says that King John gave an instruction to destroy Pevensey and Hastings Castle when he was traveling through the region. It doesn't tell us whether it happened. So the direct reference isn't that specific. And in fact, instead of coming from a royal record, it's from a chronicle, the Annals of Dunstable Priory. And they are written about this kind of period. So that counts in favour of reliability. But it's interesting that there's no royal record. This is in contrast to Knepp Castle, for example, where we have that royal record of an instruction. So there's a possibility that the chronicler misremembered, misunderstood something, but I think it's likely that this might be a reflection of the breakdown in royal authority. At this point, John was on the back foot in the conflict, and it wouldn't surprise me if we're just missing pieces of information from the historical record as administration started to break down. For example, Chichester Castle was meant to be destroyed, and we know this from the reign of John's successor, Henry III. There's a royal document which says that instructions were given to destroy the castle, but they were ignored, and so he was reissuing the instructions. Those initial orders don't survive in the historical record. We only know about them secondhand. So bits are missing, which might mean that we're missing the instruction for destroying Pevensey Castle. And of course, if John was in the area, he might just have given instructions verbally and expected them to be carried out. Doesn't necessarily leave a paper trail. So I don't think that counts against the probability of Pevensey being destroyed. With the excavation record, let's go back to the plan. An awful lot of the castle has been excavated. It's difficult to say just how much, but I I did a very crude drawing before, shading in areas where there had been excavations, and it was pretty much a third of the castle was shaded in. Now, this isn't comprehensive. Um, there are long trenches, there are small test pits, there are sections, but a lot of the castle has been investigated. So a lot of this area has been sampled, essentially. The reason this is important is that if you're looking at destruction, it doesn't need to be total. Like I said before, it could be just one section. So the destruction could have focused on, for example, this collapsed wall that was Roman on the north side of the outer curtain, or it could have focused on part of the inner bailey, which was later replaced. So there's a potential loss of evidence through later activity, but there's potential for missing the evidence just because it's a big castle and the destruction might be quite focused. What's worth noting with that collapsed wall is that we have a documentary record from the 1260s, at which point the castle was being besieged. And it mentions a collapse of a wall. For a while, it was debated whether this means this section on the north side or this larger part on the south side. But it now looks like the north side is what was meant. Part of the conclusion with that is that there's not much stonework surviving on the south side. And so that might indicate longer periods of attrition with the collapse and stone having been carried away. Just more time for stuff to have been removed. And this has been at least partly attributed to the activity of the sea, so eroding that part of the site. So we've got an awful lot of excavation to draw on. We would be looking for evidence of rubble spreads or burning. And those are quite distinctive. Rubble and say charcoal or ash doesn't necessarily mean slighting took place, but it could be a destructive event. It could be a destructive event over quite an extended period of time with, say, decay and just natural collapse at a site. So it helps when there's some dating evidence mixed in as well. But crucially, there hasn't been evidence of burning found at Pevensey, which I think would be quite telling. And where there has been rubble, it seems to be from the later medieval period. There has been some excavation within the keep as well. That took place in the 1990s. And that would have been one of the really important buildings at the site in 1216. But they just didn't find evidence of destruction at that point. So I think that's really interesting. The other source of evidence we have are the standing buildings themselves. So let's now change tab. There we go. This is another early depiction of Pevensey. And it shows the inner enclosure. and we have the coast on the right here. Uh, the castle is a bit more intact than it is now. Um, and I think you can just about make out the Roman curtain wall extending off to the left. So it shows us that at the time this was created, I think it's a 16th century depiction. It's earlier than the Buck brothers, might be early 17th. Um, this castle was already in a state of ruin. So we can see that the gatehouse was pretty wrecked at this point. Let's have another look at the gatehouse, though. Um, what I really like about this painting is the level of detail with it. The challenge with paintings is that the artistic license, essentially. Um, if you can make out the people at the bottom, the scale is off. They are tiny. And it's a large gatehouse, not as imposing as it is here, partly because there have been a couple of extra centuries of decay since. Um, but what I find interesting is that um, the windows are in the right place. You can see the coursing is fairly good. Um, the level of detail in this suggests to me that the artist was there working from the castle, and there was a lot going on. It looks to me, though, like it's largely one phase of building. The stonework in this more intact tower is largely of one color. You can see some lighter areas. Those are where the external facing stone has been removed um, or fallen apart over time. But what I would be looking for are signs of repair. And the reason this is so useful is that it's a bit more intact than it is now. I'm not seeing evidence of repair. I don't want to put too much weight onto that because it is um, uh, an artistic depiction, but it is a really interesting one. With the building surveys, um, the key area is the gatehouse, as this is the part which survives most intact from about 1200. The keep is just a stump. It's a weirdly laid out building, and there aren't many parallels, certainly not in England. But it just doesn't survive intact enough to work out when damage took place. With the gatehouse, because one tower still survives to close to its full height, even as a fragmentary ruin, we can look at the standing remains. There was a survey in the 1990s, and the archaeologist Tony Chapman was looking for evidence of slighting in 1216. That wasn't the sole focus of his work, but he did have that in mind. And he noted that what he was looking for was evidence of adaptation in the joist holes for the flooring in the castle. His line of thinking was that if the castle was slighted in 1216, a way of doing that would have been to either burn the timber elements or remove them. And if you're doing that and need to bring the gatehouse back into use, which you would have done in the mid 13th century, um, you would need to adapt the joist to allow timbers to be reinserted. And he couldn't find any evidence of them being recut or messed about with. So that's another push towards there not being evidence of destruction. And what it's pushing me towards as well is questioning whether the destruction took place. I don't doubt that King John wanted this place damaged and made less useful for his enemies, but I do wonder whether his action was acted on. So let's see what else we've got. Okay, so this takes me to the point about The castle has been rebuilt a lot. I mentioned Peter of Savoy, who held the place in the mid 13th century. He undertook a big rebuilding plan. Let's go back to the plan of the castle. There we go. So this green area uh, defining the Inner Bailey is his work. That's what was done during his tenure. So that potentially overwrites some of the archaeological record because it's likely that this would have been the same kind of area as the heart of the castle in 1216. And therefore, we lose evidence of destruction through the later building work. Um, the Some of these towers have basements which go very deep. The North Tower, in particular, you have to go down quite a large flight of stairs to reach the bottom of the tower. So, if there was evidence of destruction there, it's likely been erased by this later work. Um, and the structures themselves have been adapted, especially in the 20th century. I don't think any World War II material has negatively impacted our understanding of the events of 1216, but it's just an extra challenge because of this rich history of the site. And it's part of what makes it fun, really. There isn't a definitive answer here. I think it, let's go back to the Google Earth model. Okay. Hopefully the screen is settled and my audio is coming through clearly. Um, this is looking towards the gatehouse, this shadow building below the screen, and in the distance you can see the Roman West Gate as well. And we've got that circuit of the 13th century, nice and prominent in front of us. Why I find the events of 1216 so interesting are because it's an unusual case of slighting in that it was very much defensive. John was trying to prevent this site from being used against him. And it gets, I think, right to the heart of royal authority. When it's being used as a punishment, it's very often being followed through. But here, we've got this different dynamic. It's entirely possible that John's orders weren't followed, in which case we have to ask why. I mean, there's the difficulty of it. It's a big castle. Destruction that was meaningful would have been quite challenging. Um, I'm not sure what the weather was like in 1216, but if it was raining, that would have made starting a fire even more difficult. It's these kinds of little factors that change what happens on the ground. But there's also the aspect of the people doing the work would have had their own considerations. Um, there were cases of, so let's look at Chichester. Instead of being destroyed, that castle ended up surrendering to the French in 1216, which is probably part of the reason why Henry III, as John's successor and son, wanted it destroyed. It was kind of a statement piece. It looks like what happened there is that the people responsible for looking after the castle decided to hedge their bets, and when the enemy turned up on their doorstep, they handed over the castle. So it was a way of playing both sides in the conflict. You didn't have to hurry up with the king's orders. It's really interesting that William Marshall, one of the great knights of the age, seems to have encouraged his sons to take part in the conflict, and he had one son on each side. So, regardless of who won, he would have some influence with them. And he's a really important figure as well because he was essentially in charge of England after John's death, and while his heir was too young to rule, because he was still a child. So he was an extremely powerful man in England, um, and very astute in trying to play both sides. So I do wonder here if at Pevensey we had someone who, at a local level, was mindful that there might be hostile people coming through the area, and they could maybe use the situation to their advantage, and see which way the wind was blowing. If John started having a change of fortune and became more successful in the war, got the upper hand, then maybe the destruction would take place. But if John was losing, there was perhaps no need to be especially hasty about following his orders. And this gives some really interesting potential comparisons with other sites as well. So it may give us insight into what happened at Hastings. If you go to Hastings Castle, I mean, it's a ruin, but you do wonder what happened in 1216. Were King John's wishes followed? And with Knepp Castle, which is not especially well known, but is another Sussex castle, um, that was in use later that century. In fact, it was visited by Henry III, as well as other royalty. So we have this situation of, was this place destroyed, or was it, were the orders ignored? It gives us some insight into potentially the waning royal power, specifically King John's personal authority. So I think it gives us something to really dig our teeth into. There's no right or wrong answer, but I like the process of trying to unpick the difficulties, see what the different types of evidence say, and try to reach a conclusion. So I do have a particular preference for interpretation. Um, when I've done this in person, I've taken a show of hands, but I don't think that's going to work right now because I can't see anyone's screen. But maybe that's something for the Q&A. I will tip my hand here and say that I think King John's orders were ignored in 1216 and that Pevensey Castle was left intact. But it adds to the richness of understanding this phenomenon of slighting, a particular kind of destruction. And I think that sites like this, where the evidence is equivocal, um, give us new ways of understanding destruction and royal authority. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop the recording there and stop screen sharing.